In November of 2019, police cars surrounded a quiet property in Allegan County, Michigan. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, confused by the flashing lights cutting through the still evening air. What they didn't know was that the man being led away in handcuffs, 70-year-old Dennis Lee Bowman, was about to answer for a crime committed 39 years earlier, hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. The arrest stunned everyone who knew him. To most, Bowman was a polite retiree, someone who waved to children at the mailbox and tended his yard every morning. But law enforcement knew they were confronting the hidden face of a murderer, a man who had evaded justice since 1980. The victim? Kathleen Doyle, a 25-year-old Navy wife who was found lifeless inside her home while her husband was deployed overseas. She had been young, hopeful, and full of life, preparing for her husband's return when her story was cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. For nearly 4 decades, her family waited in silence, clinging to a single question. Who could do this to her? How does a case grow cold for that long? How can evidence sleep in storage while a killer walks free? And what finally changed after all those years that allowed investigators to bring her murderer to justice? Those questions would not be answered overnight. They would demand new science, new determination, and the persistence of a grieving father who refused to let his daughter's name fade from memory. Before we begin this case, let us take a brief moment for something important. A prayer for every victim of a cold case and every family still waiting for answers. Heavenly Father, we ask for comfort for those whose lives were shattered by loss and silence. We pray that truth will always find its way to light, no matter how many years have passed. May the families who wait for justice be granted strength, and may every forgotten victim be remembered in mercy and peace. Welcome to Solved Cases, a place where real stories remind us that time may pass, but justice does not expire. If you care about truth, compassion, and the people behind these long-forgotten cases, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive, and it reminds the world that every name still matters. Now let's return to 1980, to a Navy town alive with routine and reunion, a place where a young woman believed her husband's absence was the hardest part of her life. No one could have known that her quiet home on Granby Street would soon become the center of one of Virginia's most haunting cold cases. To understand the weight of what happened, we must first return to Norfolk, Virginia in 1980, a city whose rhythm was shaped by the United States Navy. Every corner echoed with deployment schedules, homecomings, and the sound of jets overhead. Life here moved in cycles of waiting and reunion, of families learning to carry on while loved ones served thousands of miles away. Among these families lived Kathleen O'Brien Doyle, known affectionately as Kathy. She was 25 years old, bright, graceful, and grounded. Her friends often said she had a calming presence that made people feel seen and understood. Kathy had grown up surrounded by discipline and service. Her father, a respected naval officer, raised her to be strong, independent, and composed in uncertain times. She knew what it meant to wave goodbye at the docks and to hold faith through months of absence. That strength would define her short life, and it would later become the force that kept her story alive long after she was gone. She was newly married to Stephen Doyle, a U.S. Navy pilot serving aboard the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. Their relationship was a story many military couples shared. Letters exchanged across oceans, phone calls cut short by static, and the promise of reunion always just out of reach. When Stephen deployed to the Indian Ocean in 1980, Kathy stayed behind in their modest home at 9432 Granby Street, a small house not far from the local Methodist church. The home reflected who she was, simple, organized, and filled with small touches of warmth. Friends described it as a place where laughter was frequent and company was always welcome. Kathy wasn't someone who kept to herself. She was known for stopping by neighbors' porches just to ask about their day, for remembering birthdays, and for offering a listening ear when someone's spouse was away at sea. Her closest friend, Vivian Mahoney, lived nearby. The two women spent evenings sharing stories, recipes, and the comfort that only another Navy wife could offer. Their bond was the kind that turned ordinary nights into moments of calm in an uncertain world. Vivian would later become the last person to see Kathy alive. a fact that would weigh heavily on her for years to come. In the summer of 1980, life in Norfolk felt peaceful. The economy of the port city was steady, the community close-knit, and for families like the Doyles, the biggest challenge seemed to be enduring another long deployment. But Kathy wasn't one to complain. She stayed busy, volunteering locally, keeping in touch with her parents, and planning a small gathering for Stephen's next visit home. Her father, proud of her independence, often said she had inherited her mother's heart and his willpower. He had no way of knowing that one day, those very traits would fuel his lifelong pursuit of justice in her name. Kathy's last recorded days were ordinary, comforting in their simplicity. She ran errands, spent time with friends, and called her family to talk about small things: the weather, the mail, and the hope that Stephen would call soon. To those around her, she was simply Kathy, kind, dependable, and endlessly thoughtful. But on the evening of September 9th, 1980, everything changed. The house that had once been a symbol of love and patience would soon become the center of a tragedy that shook not only Norfolk, but an entire generation of Navy families. The warmth that once filled the Doyle home would be replaced by questions, grief, and silence that lasted for nearly 4 decades. It began quietly, with a friend's unanswered phone call, a newspaper left untouched, and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. It was Tuesday, September 9th, 1980, an ordinary evening in Norfolk, Virginia. The late summer air was still warm, and inside her small Granby Street home, Kathleen Doyle prepared for another quiet night. Her husband, Navy pilot Stephen Doyle, was deployed overseas, and though she missed him deeply, she was used to solitude. That night, Kathleen wasn't alone. Her close friend, Vivian Mahoney, came over to share a glass of wine and a few hours of conversation. The two women had become like sisters, bound by the rhythm of military life and the comfort of familiar faces. They talked about everyday things: letters from Stephen, plans for the upcoming weekend, and the simple hope of hearing good news from loved ones stationed far from home. According to Vivian, Kathy was her usual cheerful self, relaxed, talkative, and full of small laughter that came easily. When the clock neared 9:30 p.m., Vivian stood to leave. Kathy walked her to the door, thanked her for coming, and waved her off with the kind of warmth that made everyone feel welcome in her presence. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. At 9:32 p.m., phone records later showed that Kathy made a long-distance call to a friend out of state. It went unanswered. That was the final trace of her before the line fell silent. The following morning, Wednesday, September 10th, Vivian called her friends several times but got no response. She told herself that maybe Kathy had gone out early or was visiting someone on base. But as the day went on, something didn't sit right. Kathy was reliable. She always returned calls, especially from friends checking in while their spouses were deployed. By that evening, Vivian's worry grew heavier. She tried again and again, but the phone only rang. The next day, a newspaper sat untouched on Kathy's doorstep. Then another, and another. By Thursday, September 11th, Vivian could no longer shake the dread that something was wrong. She convinced her husband, James Mahoney, to drive with her to the Granby Street home around midday. They pulled up outside, noticing the quiet that hung over the house. No movement, no answer at the door. Vivian pushed gently on the handle. It opened. Inside, everything appeared still. The living room was tidy, a glass sat on the counter, and the faint smell of perfume lingered in the air. For a brief moment, she thought maybe Kathy had simply gone somewhere. But as she called out her name and stepped farther into the house, the stillness began to feel unnatural. She reached the bedroom door. It was partially open. What she saw inside froze her in place. Kathy lay on the floor beside the bed. The room was in disarray, the signs of a violent struggle visible at every glance. Vivian's scream shattered the silence as she ran from the room, calling for her husband. James rushed in and confirmed the unthinkable. Kathleen Doyle was dead. Paramedics and police arrived soon after. By 12 p.m., Kathleen was officially pronounced deceased. Detectives carefully documented the room, noting the overturned mattress, the signs of restraint, and the evidence of a brutal assault. Nothing about the scene suggested a random burglary, There were no broken locks, no shattered windows, just questions that demanded answers. In the span of 3 days, a bright young woman, loved by her friends and family, had gone from sharing laughter in her home to becoming the victim of one of Norfolk's most disturbing crimes. Vivian never fully recovered from that day. In later interviews, she said she still remembered every detail: the quiet house, the still air. The moment she realized her friend was gone, it was a scene that would haunt her forever. Before we continue, let me ask you something. When you think about safety, in your home, in your neighborhood, do you ever wonder how much has truly changed since 1980? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about what trust means today compared to a time when people left doors unlocked, believing danger was far away. The crime scene at 9432 Granby Street was unlike anything Norfolk detectives had seen in years. The home of Kathleen Doyle, once warm and full of life, had become the setting of a violent assault that spoke to unrestrained cruelty. Paramedics confirmed what everyone feared. Kathleen was beyond help. She had been attacked inside her bedroom, the one place that should have offered safety. When investigators entered, they found her hands bound tightly behind her back and a cord looped around her neck, showing the deliberate intent to silence her. There were visible injuries that told the story of a sustained and merciless struggle. Furniture was displaced, clothing torn, and a marble rolling pin from the kitchen lay nearby, stained and out of place. The medical examiner, Dr. Presswala, conducted the autopsy the next day. His report revealed the full extent of the violence inflicted on Kathleen. She had endured sexual assault, blunt force trauma, and multiple stab wounds. There were bruises along her face and abdomen, consistent with repeated blows. One stab wound had struck a rib so forcefully that the bone fractured, halting the blade's progress. Another had entered her back. The cause of death was listed as mechanical asphyxia by strangulation and stab wounds with internal hemorrhage. It was an act of personal rage, close, physical, and driven by dominance. Whoever committed it hadn't just wanted to kill, they wanted control. Detectives faced an immediate challenge. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. The windows were closed, though several were found unlocked. It suggested that the killer might have simply walked in through an unlatched opening, or that Kathleen had trusted the person enough to let them inside. That single question, did she know her killer, would follow the case for decades. Every inch of the small house was processed for evidence. Crime scene photographs captured everything from overturned bedding to smudged fingerprints on furniture. Technicians collected hairs, fibers, and biological material, hoping for something that could one day identify the suspect. A partial fingerprint was lifted from inside the bedroom. It didn't match Kathleen, her husband, or her friend Vivian Mahoney. It belonged to someone else, someone unaccounted for. But in 1980, there was little they could do. The fingerprint went into a physical file, waiting for a match that never came. The most crucial piece of evidence was biological. Semen recovered from the assault. It confirmed a male perpetrator, but in 1980, DNA profiling didn't exist. Technology could determine that the attacker was male, but it couldn't reveal who. Detectives worked tirelessly, interviewing neighbors, friends, and anyone with a connection to the Doyles. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service joined the effort, given Stephen Doyle's active duty status. Every potential lead was checked: co-workers, acquaintances, even passers-by. None of it led anywhere. The investigation soon hit a wall, built by the limits of its era. Forensics could only go so far. Computers weren't yet integrated into police systems, and interagency databases were still in their infancy. Investigators relied on handwritten notes, phone calls, and luck. As months turned into years, the case file thickened, but progress stalled. Every new detective who reviewed it found the same evidence, the same unanswered questions, and the same frustration. The absence of DNA technology meant that the most damning evidence sat sealed in storage, waiting for a future generation to catch up. Meanwhile, Kathleen's husband returned from deployment to a world that no longer made sense. His wife was gone, and the person responsible had vanished without trace. For her family, grief hardened into something unrelenting. a mission to ensure her name would never be forgotten. By 1981, the investigation went quiet. Tips dried up, leads faded, and the trail went cold. The case that once consumed Norfolk's detectives became another folder stored away in the homicide archives. A name on a shelf that would haunt the department for nearly 40 years. But time has a way of preserving truth. Evidence doesn't disappear, it waits. And in this case, it waited for science to catch up, for a world that could finally read the clues left behind in 1980. In the years that followed, the Doyle case slipped from headlines but never from the hearts of those who loved Kathleen. The young Navy wife who once filled her Granby Street home with laughter became a symbol of unfinished justice, a reminder that some wounds do not heal with time. Her family refused to let her story fade, especially her father, a retired naval officer who turned his grief into duty. He called detectives regularly, writing letters, requesting updates, and urging new eyes to review the file whenever a new cold case team was assigned. He became, in many ways, the quiet force that kept the investigation alive. Each time the case resurfaced, it carried the same promise. We'll find him. But months turned into years and years into decades. Leads dried up, detectives retired, the evidence sat preserved, carefully sealed, waiting for a breakthrough that technology had not yet made possible. Through all those years, the Norfolk Police Department worked closely with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, because Kathleen's husband was serving on active duty when she was killed. The connection ensured the case remained open within both agencies. Files were transferred, reviewed, and rechecked, but no new suspect ever emerged. For Kathleen's family, the waiting became its own kind of torment. Every phone call from investigators carried a flicker of hope, followed by disappointment. Her father, in particular, carried the loss like a lifelong mission. Friends said that even into his later years, he kept a framed photo of his daughter on his desk beside a small notepad where he recorded every contact with detectives. Names, dates, and the smallest progress updates. He passed away in 2016, never knowing how close the truth was. But his persistence mattered more than he ever realized. His steady pressure made sure the evidence was never discarded, never forgotten, and never lost to the bureaucratic shuffle that so often claims old cases. Meanwhile, new forensic science was reshaping how investigators looked at the past. By the 1990s, DNA analysis had changed the world of criminal justice. What was once just a biological sample had become a genetic signature, a voice that could speak long after a crime had gone silent. That voice, buried in the evidence collected from Kathleen's body, was about to be heard for the first time. But back then, the Doyle family had no idea. To them, the passing years felt like an endless hallway, each turn leading to another dead end. Still, they never gave up, and that persistence, that refusal to let go, would one day connect the past to the present, bringing light to a case that had lived in darkness for almost 40 years. Before we continue, I'd like to ask you, the viewer, for something meaningful. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a moment to share this video or comment below and subscribe in honor of every cold case victim whose name has yet to be spoken in court. Your support reminds the world that justice has no expiration date. For nearly 40 years, the case file labeled Kathleen Doyle, 1980 homicide, sat in the Norfolk archives, waiting for a world that could finally understand what the evidence had been trying to say. Inside that file was a small vial containing biological material preserved from the original crime scene, proof of a sexual assault that had for decades identified only a male suspect. At the time, there was no way to trace it, but by the late 1990s, DNA profiling was transforming criminal investigations. Detectives reopened the Doyle evidence, extracted a full genetic profile, and entered it into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. It was a national database that compared DNA samples from thousands of convicted offenders and crime scenes across the country. For years, the entry sat in the system with no matches. The killer was still out there, living, breathing, unregistered. By the late 2010s, a new tool emerged: investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. This approach didn't rely on criminal databases but on publicly available genetic data, the same kind used by everyday people tracing their ancestry. For cold case detectives, it was a revolution, one that could turn decades of silence into names and faces. In 2019, the Norfolk Police Cold Case Unit and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, partnered with expert genealogists to revisit Kathleen Doyle's evidence. The preserved DNA sample was uploaded to public genealogy platforms. Within weeks, analysts found distant relatives, distant but connected. From those fragments, they built an intricate family tree, tracing branches backward and forward until a single name began to emerge from the search. Dennis Lee Bowman. Bowman was 70 years old, living quietly in Allegan County, Michigan. To his neighbors, he appeared ordinary, polite, soft-spoken, and unremarkable. But the data left no room for doubt. Investigators obtained a discarded item from Bowman, something he had thrown away in public. When the sample was tested, the result was immediate and conclusive. The DNA matched the material recovered from Kathleen Doyle's body in 1980. After 39 years, the silence had finally broken. What began as a forgotten entry in a database had now become the link to a man who had evaded justice for nearly 4 decades. But as detectives prepared to arrest him, they had no idea that solving Kathleen's case would open the door to another tragedy, one buried even deeper, waiting to be uncovered in his own backyard. On November 22, 2019, the stillness of rural Allegan County, Michigan, was broken by the sound of engines and the flash of blue lights. Law enforcement vehicles lined the dirt road leading to a modest property surrounded by tall trees. Inside the house lived Dennis Lee Bowman, a man whose name had just been linked by DNA to a murder committed nearly 4 decades earlier in Norfolk, Virginia. The arrest operation was precise and overwhelming. Officers from the Norfolk Police Department, Michigan State Police, and the Allegan County Sheriff's Office coordinated the takedown. Forensic units combed the area, and even a bomb squad robot was deployed to ensure the scene was safe before entry. Neighbors watched from their windows, stunned. To them, Bowman was simply the quiet older man who mowed his lawn and waved politely. But to the detectives on site, he was the person responsible for ending the life of a young Navy wife in 1980, a man who had escaped accountability for nearly 40 years. Bowman was taken into custody without resistance. He said little as he was led to a waiting patrol car. Hours later, the Norfolk Police Department released a statement that captured the gravity of the moment. This 39-year-long investigation demonstrates our commitment to pursue justice for victims and their families no matter how long it takes. No victim is ever forgotten. For the Doyle and O'Brien families, those words carried both relief and sorrow. Justice had finally arrived, but decades too late for Kathleen's father to witness it. As detectives continued their work, another discovery emerged, one that stunned everyone involved. While investigating Bowman's background, authorities uncovered a disturbing detail. He had an adopted daughter named Aundria Bowman, who had been missing since 1989. Her disappearance had long been labeled a runaway case, based on Bowman's own claims that she had stolen money and fled their Michigan home. But when investigators revisited that file, inconsistencies appeared. Witnesses remembered Aundria as bright and outspoken, a teenager who had recently confided to friends about troubles at home. The timing of her disappearance, only months after she reportedly accused her adoptive father of abuse, began to take on new meaning. Detectives realized they were not just dealing with the resolution of a cold case, but the unmasking of a predator who had lived undetected for decades. The man who smiled at his neighbors, attended community events, and lived a quiet rural life had been hiding the weight of 2 tragedies, one in Virginia, one in Michigan. Evil had not vanished. It had adapted, aged, and disguised itself in ordinary habits. And soon investigators would learn that Kathleen Doyle wasn't Bowman's only victim. His confession would expose a second murder that had haunted another mother for 30 years. When detectives confronted Dennis Lee Bowman with the DNA results linking him to the 1980 murder of Kathleen Doyle, his carefully built mask began to slip. He was 70 years old, frail in appearance, but his silence held decades of concealed truth. As Bowman awaited extradition to Virginia, investigators in Michigan reopened another file, the disappearance of 14-year-old Aundria Bowman, reported missing in March 1989. The case had long been written off as a runaway, Bowman and his wife had insisted that Aundria stole money and fled after an argument. There was no evidence to prove otherwise until now. In early 2020, while sitting in custody, Bowman began to talk. The weight of the reopened investigation, combined with the pressure from both states, broke him. During questioning, he admitted what detectives had suspected, but never been able to prove. Aundria had not run away. She had died in that house. Bowman confessed that his adopted daughter had accused him of sexual abuse. When she threatened to report him, he struck her, a blow that caused her death. Instead of calling for help, he took steps that revealed the full measure of his cruelty. He told investigators that he dismembered her body using tools from his shed, an axe and a machete, then hid what was left on his property in Monterey Township, just a few miles from where he lived. Following his confession, search teams moved onto Bowman's land with forensic equipment and ground-penetrating radar. Within days, they found skeletal remains buried under a thin layer of cement. DNA testing confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Aundria Bowman. For her biological mother, who had never stopped searching, the discovery was both devastating and redemptive. The arrest that solved one cold case had also given her the answer she had waited 3 decades to hear. In a single year, 2 families separated by distance and time found closure through the same man's downfall. The same investigation that uncovered Kathleen Doyle's killer had revealed another life he had stolen. This time, his own daughter's. Justice had finally caught up with him, but it came with the realization that one solved case had unearthed another buried truth. A reminder that evil often hides behind familiarity, and that no matter how carefully it's buried, truth has a way of rising back to the surface. After nearly 40 years of waiting, justice finally arrived in 2020. Following his arrest and extradition to Virginia, Dennis Lee Bowman stood before the Norfolk Circuit Court, facing charges for the 1980 murder of Kathleen Doyle. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA match was absolute, and Bowman knew there was no escaping the truth. Rather than endure a lengthy trial, he entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder, rape, and burglary. In June 2020, the court handed down its sentence: 2 life terms for the murder and rape, plus an additional 20 years for the burglary. There was no possibility of parole. For the Doyle and O'Brien families, it was the moment they had prayed for, an acknowledgement that Kathleen's name would no longer rest in a file marked unsolved. During sentencing, a statement written by Kathleen's father was read aloud in court. Though he had passed away in 2016, his words carried the strength of a man who had never stopped fighting for his daughter. He wrote that no description could ever capture who Kathleen truly was. That language itself failed to express her kindness, her faith, and the light she brought to everyone around her. His letter ended with a wish that justice, though late, would finally bring her peace. As the courtroom listened in silence, it was clear that his perseverance had helped make that day possible. For decades, his persistence had been the invisible thread connecting every generation of detectives who refused to let the case die. After his sentencing in Virginia, Bowman was returned to Michigan to face charges for the 1989 murder of Aundria Bowman. In December 2021, he entered a no-contest plea to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 35 to 50 years in prison. For both families, justice was finally complete. Bowman would spend the remainder of his life behind bars, his crimes exposed and his freedom gone. The story of Kathleen Doyle and Aundria Bowman stands as a testament to endurance, proof that truth can survive time, distance, and silence. Through unwavering faith, tireless investigation, and advances in science, 2 young lives that once seemed lost to history were finally honored with justice. When a case remains unsolved for decades, it tests not only the patience of families, but the faith of entire communities. Yet this story reminds us that time cannot erase truth. It can only delay it. Kathleen Doyle and Aundria Bowman were taken from the world far too soon. But through faith, science, and persistence, their names now stand as symbols of endurance, proof that no matter how many years pass, justice still has a voice. Their stories teach us something vital, that perseverance can outlast fear, and that even in silence, hope continues to work quietly in the background until the right moment arrives. Let us take a moment to honor their memory and the memories of every victim whose case still waits for closure. Heavenly Father, we lift up the families who continue to wait for answers. We ask for comfort in their grief and courage in their search for truth. May the light of justice never fade, and may every life lost be remembered with compassion and respect. Man. Before we close, if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe to Cold Reports. Your support helps keep the memories of victims alive and reminds the world that every cold case deserves to be told until justice is done.